Hey guys, Miss Laura here. Last we were reading in the Reptile Room. It was chapter 8, and the orphans were trying to get Mr. Poe to realize who Stefano was, and he wasn't having any, hearing it at all. And Violet had some sort of idea at the very end, and she started leading Claus and Sunny somewhere else, and Claus was like, "Where are we going? What are we doing?" And Sunny was also like, "What's going on?" Obviously in her own way, as she's a baby. And she just shook her head and walked faster toward the reptile room. That's where we ended. So now we are on to chapter 9. This is video 4. I think this is the 4th video. So I will be sure and write that down. And we're going to read chapter 9 now. When Violet opened the enormous door of the reptile room, the reptiles were still in their cages. The books were still on their shelves, and the morning sun was still streaming through the glass walls. But the place was simply not the same. Even though Dr. Lucafont had removed Uncle Monty's body, the reptile room was not as inviting as it used to be, and probably never would be. What happens in a certain place can stain your feelings for that location, just as ink can stain a white sheet. You can wash it and still never forget what has transpired. A word here which means happened and made everybody sad. "I don't want to go in," Claus said. "Uncle Monty died in here." "I know we don't want to be here," Violet said, "but we have work to do." "Work?" Claus asked. "What work?" Violet gritted her teeth. "We have work to do," she said. "That Mr. Poe should be doing, but as usual, he is well-intentioned, but of no real help." Claus and Sunny sighed as she spoke out loud, a sentiment all 3 siblings had never said but always felt since Mr. Poe had taken over their affairs. "Mr. Poe doesn't believe that Stefano and Count Olaf are the same person, and he believes that Uncle Monty's death was an accident. We have to prove him wrong on both accounts." "But Stefano doesn't have the tattoo," Claus pointed out, "and Dr. Lucafont found the venom of the Mamba du Mal in Monty's veins." I know, Violet said impatiently. "The 3 of us know the truth. But in order to convince the adults, we have to find evidence and proof of Stefano's plan." "If only we'd found evidence and proof earlier," Claus said glumly, "then maybe we could have saved Uncle Monty's life." "But we'll never know about that," Violet said quietly. She looked around the reptile room, which Monty had worked on his whole life. "But if we put Stefano behind bars for his murder, at least we'll be able to prevent him from harming anyone else." "Including us," Claus pointed out. "Including us," Violet agreed. "Now, Claus, find all of Uncle Monty's books that might contain information about the Mamba du Mal. Let me know when you find anything." "But all that research could take days," Claus said, looking at Monty's considerable library. "Well, we don't have days," Violet said firmly. "We don't even have hours. At 5 o'clock, the Prospero leaves Hazy Harbor, and Stefano is going to do everything he can to make sure we're on that ship. And if we end up alone in Peru with him..." All right, Claus said. "Let's get started. Here, you take this book." "I'm not taking any book," Violet said. "While you're in the library, I'm going up to Stefano's room to see if I can find any clues." "Alone?" Claus asked. "In his room?" "It'll be perfectly safe," Violet said, although she knew nothing of the kind. "Get cracking with the books, Claus. Sunny, watch the door and bite anybody who tries to get in." "Act right," Sunny said, which probably meant something like, "Roger." Violet left, and true to her word, Sunny sat near the door with her teeth bared. Claus walked to the far end of the room where the library was, carefully avoiding the aisle where the poisonous snakes were kept. He didn't even want to look at the Mamba du Mal or any other deadly reptile, even though Claus knew that Uncle Monty's death was the fault of Stefano and not really of the snake. He could not bear to look at the reptile who had put an end to the happy times he and his sisters had enjoyed. Claus sighed and opened a book, and as at so many other times when the middle Baudelaire child did not want to think about his circumstances, he began to read. It is now necessary for me to use the rather hackneyed phrase, "Meanwhile, back at the ranch." The word hackneyed here means used by so many writers that by the time Lemony Snicket uses it, it's a tiresome cliche. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, is a phrase used to link what's going on in one part of a story to what's going on in another part of the story, and it has nothing to do with cows or horses or any of the people who work in rural areas where ranches are, or even with ranch dressing, which is creamy and put on salads. Here the phrase meanwhile back at the ranch refers to what Violet was doing while Claus and Sunny were in the reptile room. For as Claus began his research in Uncle Monty's library and Sunny guarded the door with her sharp teeth, Violet was up to something of interest. I'm sure will be of interest to you. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Violet went to listen at the door, trying to catch what the adults were saying. As I'm sure you know, the key to good eavesdropping is not getting caught, and Violet moved as quietly as she could, trying not to step on any creaky parts of the floor. When she reached the door of the kitchen, she took her hair ribbon out of her pocket and dropped it on the floor, so if anyone opened the door, she could claim she was kneeling down to pick it up, rather than to eavesdrop. This was a trick she had learned when she was very small, when she would listen at her parents' bedroom door to hear what they might be planning for her birthday. And like all good tricks, it still worked. But, Mr. Poe, if Stefano rides with me in my car and you drive Dr. Montgomery's Jeep, Dr. Lucafont was saying, then how will you know the way? I see your point, Mr. Poe said, but I don't think Sunny will be willing to sit on Dr. Montgomery's lap if he's dead. We'll have to work out another way. I wouldn't want to sit on a dead guy's lap. I've got it, Stefano said. I will drive the children in Dr. Lucafont's car, and Dr. Lucafont can go with you and Dr. Montgomery in Dr. Montgomery's Jeep. I'm afraid that won't work, Dr. Lucafont said gravely. The city laws won't allow anybody else to drive my car. And we haven't even discussed the issue of the children's luggage, Mr. Poe said. Violet stood up, having heard enough to know she had enough time to go up to Stefano's room. Quietly, Violet walked up the staircase and down the hallway towards Stefano's door, where he had sat holding the knife that fearsome night. When she reached his door, Violet stopped. It was amazing, she thought, how everything having to do with Count Olaf was frightening. He was such a terrible person that merely the sight of his bedroom door could get her heart pounding. Violet found herself half hoping that Stefano would bound up the stairs and stop her, just so she wouldn't have to open this door and go into the room where he slept. But then Violet thought of her own safety and the safety of her two siblings. If one's safety is threatened, one finds courage one didn't know one had, and the eldest Baudelaire found she could be brave enough to open the door. Her shoulders still aching from the car collision, Violet turned the brass handle of the door and walked inside. The room, as Violet suspected, was a dirty mess. The bed was unmade and had cracker crumbs and bits of hair all over it. Discarded newspapers and mail order catalogs lay on the floor in untidy piles. On top of the dresser was a small assortment of half-empty wine bottles. The closet door was open, revealing a bunch of rusty wire coat hangers that shivered in the drafty room. The curtains over the windows were all bunched up and encrusted with something flaky. As Violet drew closer, she realized with faint horror that Stefano had blown his nose on them. But although it was disgusting, hardened phlegm was not the sort of evidence Violet was hoping for. The eldest Baudelaire orphan stood in the center of the room and surveyed the sticky disorder of the bedroom. Everything was horrendous. Nothing was helpful. Violet rubbed her sore shoulder and remembered when she and her siblings were living with Count Olaf and found themselves locked in his tower room. Although it was frightening to be trapped in his inner sanctum, a phrase here which means filthy room in which evil plans are devised, it turned out to be quite useful because they were able to read up on nuptial law and work their way out of their predicament. But here in Stefano's inner sanctum at Uncle Monty's house, all Violet could find were signs of uncleanliness. Somewhere Stefano must have left a trail of evidence that Violet could find and convince Mr. Poe, but where was it? Disheartened and afraid she had spent too much time in Stefano's bedroom, Violet went quietly back downstairs. No, Mr. Poe was saying when she stopped to listen at the kitchen door again. Dr. Montgomery can't drive, he's dead. There must be a way to do this. I've told you over and over, Stefano said. And Violet could tell that he was growing angry. The easiest way is for me to take the 3 children into town while you follow with Dr. Lucafont and the corpse. What could be simpler? Perhaps you're right, Mr. Poe said with a sigh, and Violet hurried to the reptile room. Claus, Claus, she cried. Tell me you found something. I went to Stefano's room, but there's nothing there to help us, and I think Stefano's going to get us alone in his car. Claus smiled for an answer and began to read out loud from a book he was holding. The mamba du mal, he read, is one of the deadliest snakes in the hemisphere, noted for its strangulatory grip, used in conjunction with its deadly venom, giving all of its victims a tenebrous hue, which is ghastly to behold. Strangulatory, conjunction, tenebrous, hue, Violet repeated. I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't either, Claus admitted, until I looked up some of the words. Strangulatory means to have to do with strangling. In conjunction means together. Tenebrous means dark. And hue means color. So the mamba du mal is noted for strangling people while it bites them, leaving their corpses dark with bruises. Stop, stop, Violet cried, covering her ears. I don't want to hear any more about what happened to Uncle Monty. You don't understand, Claus said gently. That isn't what happened to Uncle Monty. But Dr. Lucafont said there was the venom of the mamba du mal in Monty's veins, she said. I'm sure there was, Claus said, but the snake didn't put it there. If it had, Uncle Monty's body would have been dark with bruises. But you and I remember that it was pale as can be. Violet started to speak, but then stopped, remembering the pale, pale face of Uncle Monty when they discovered him. That's true, she said. But then how was he poisoned? Remember how Uncle Monty said he kept the venoms of all his poisonous snakes in test tubes to study them? Claus said. I think Stefano took the venom and injected it into Uncle Monty. Really? Violet shuddered. That's awful. Okey-pee, Sunny shrieked, apparently in agreement. When we tell Mr. Poe about this, Claus said confidently, Stefano will be arrested for Uncle Monty's murder and sent to jail. No longer will he try to whisk us away to Peru or threaten us with knives or make us carry his suitcase or anything like that. Violet looked at her brother, her eyes wide with excitement. Suitcase, she said. His suitcase. What are you talking about? Claus said quizzically. And Violet was about to explain when there was a knock at the door. Come in, Violet called, signaling to Sunny not to bite Mr. Poe as he walked in. I hope you are feeling a bit calmer, Mr. Poe said, looking at each of the children in turn, and no longer entertaining the thought that Stefano is Count Olaf. When Mr. Poe used the word entertaining here, he meant thinking, rather than singing or dancing or putting on skits. Even if he's not Count Olaf, Claus said carefully, we think he may be responsible for Uncle Monty's death. Nonsense, Mr. Poe exclaimed as Violet shook her head at her brother. Uncle Monty's death was a terrible accident and nothing more. Claus held up the book he was reading. But while you were in the kitchen, we were reading about snakes and... Reading about snakes, Mr. Poe said. I should think that you'd want to read about anything but snakes after what happened to Dr. Montgomery. But I found out something, Claus said, that... It doesn't matter what you found out about snakes, Mr. Poe said, taking out a handkerchief. The Baudelaires waited while he coughed into it before returning it to his pocket. It doesn't matter, he said again, what you found out about snakes. Stefano doesn't want to know anything about snakes. He told us that himself. But, Claus said, he stopped when he saw Violet. She shook her head at him again, just slightly. It was a signal telling him not to say anything more to Mr. Poe. He looked at his sister and then at Mr. Poe and shut his mouth. Mr. Poe coughed slightly into his handkerchief and looked at his wristwatch. Now that we have settled this matter, there is the issue of riding in the car. I know that the three of you were eager to see the inside of a doctor's automobile, but we've discussed it over and over, and there simply is no way it can work. You three are going to ride with Stefano into town, while I ride with Dr. Lucafont and your Uncle Monty. Stefano and Dr. Lucafont are unloading all the bags now, and we will leave in a few minutes. If you will excuse me, I have to call the Herbological Society and tell them the bad news. Mr. Poe coughed once more into his handkerchief and left the room. Why didn't you want me to tell Mr. Poe what I read? Claus asked Violet, when he was sure Mr. Poe was out of earshot, a word here which means close enough to hear him. Violet didn't answer. She was looking through the glass wall of the reptile room, watching Dr. Lucafont and Stefano walk past the snake-shaped hedges to Uncle Monty's Jeep. Stefano opened the Jeep door, and Dr. Lucafont began to carry suitcases out of the back seat in his strangely stiff hands. Violet, why didn't you want me to tell Mr. Poe what I read? When the adults come to fetch us, Violet said, ignoring Claus's question, keep them in the reptile room until I get back. But how will I do that? Claus asked. Create a distraction, Violet answered impatiently, still looking out the window at the little pile of suitcases Dr. Lucafont was making. What distraction? Claus asked anxiously. How? For goodness sake, Claus, his older sister replied. You have read hundreds of books. Surely you must have read something about creating a distraction. Claus thought for a second. In order to win the Trojan War, he said, the ancient Greeks hid soldiers inside an enormous wooden horse. That was sort of a distraction, but I don't have time to build a wooden horse. Then you'll have to think of something else, Violet said, and began to walk toward the door, still gazing out the window. Claus and Sunny looked first at their sister and then out the window of the reptile room in the direction she was looking. It is remarkable that different people will have different thoughts when they look at the same thing. For when the two younger Baudelaires looked at the pile of suitcases, all they thought was that unless they did something quickly, they would end up alone in Uncle Monty's Jeep with Stefano. But from the way Violet was staring as she walked out of the reptile room, she was obviously thinking something else. Claus and Sunny could not imagine what it was, but somehow their sister had reached a different conclusion as she looked at her own brown suitcase, or perhaps the beige one that had held Claus's things, or the tiny gray one that was Sunny's, or maybe the large black one with the shiny silver padlock that belonged to Stefano. That's the end of that chapter. Okay, so I'm going to continue to upload these. I'm actually having a lot of fun, so I don't know if you can tell, but I like this story. I have never read these, and I'm enjoying reading them along with you. When I upload a video, you will get a notification if you will subscribe on the YouTube channel. I'm going to continue to put them up on my Facebook channel for people to see. I'm sure Miss Ange will continue to put them up on the Expressions channel. I hope everybody's getting to read them. And yeah, we'll just keep on trucking. Hope you guys are doing well. Remember, be nice to people.